In this lesson, we will become familiar with the coordinate plane. We will also talk about how to graph an ordered pair on the coordinate plane. So let's start with learning the parts. We'll start with the x-axis. The x-axis is the horizontal line that is in the coordinate plane. The y-axis is the vertical line that stretches across the coordinate plane. The origin is the place where the x and the y-axis cross. It's labeled with 0. Then we have the quadrant. A quadrant is the space that's created when the x and y axes cross. This is only a partial picture of the coordinate plane, and we're actually seeing 1 out of 4 quadrants. This one's called quadrant 1. So let's go ahead and label that as Q1 for short, quadrant 1. Okay, and the last thing that we want to discuss is the meaning of ordered pair. Ordered pair is a way to explain the placing of a point in the coordinate plane. So let's do an example. Let's say I have a point that is right here. That point is placed where 2 lines cross. In order to describe the location of that point on the coordinate plane, I can use an ordered pair. In order to figure out what the ordered pair looks like, you always start at the origin here. And we always go across the x-axis first, and then we figure out how far up the y-axis we would have to go to get to that point. We can remember this by always looking at an ordered pair as an XY. That shows you that you always go across the x-axis first and then the y-axis. So let's look at this point. I'm going to start at my origin. In order to get to that point, I would have to go across 1, 2, 3, 4 spaces on the x-axis. Then I need to figure out how far up to go. Well, according to the y-axis, I need to go up 1 space. That tells me I go across 4 spaces on the x-axis, 1 space on the y-axis. So in this particular case, this point would be labeled as 4, 1, because we went across 4 spaces and up 1 space. That's how you label an ordered pair. Now, as I mentioned earlier, the picture that you're seeing right now is only a partial picture of the coordinate plane. Because when you think of number lines don't start at 0 and only go in a positive direction. Or vertical number lines don't start at 0 and only go in a positive direction. They actually can go the opposite direction, which would give us negative numbers. So the x-axis can extend to the left, which would mean if this is 0, it would go -1, -2, -3, and so on. The y-axis works the same way. It goes up into positive numbers, but it can also go down into negative numbers. -1, -2, -3, -4, and so on. So you can see that our coordinate plane is actually divided into 4 parts when we extend our number lines into the negatives. Here's one part, or one quadrant. Here's a second quadrant. Here's a third quadrant. And here's a fourth quadrant. Okay, I want to give you a chance to get some of this down in your notes so you'll have something to look back on. So let me draw a full coordinate graph with you. Okay, we'll start with the x-axis. It goes across like this. We'll label that the x-axis. And then we'll do our vertical number line. If you remember, that one is labeled as the y-axis. I would pause this video as needed so you can catch up with me and draw the parts. Okay, once we've got our axis drawn, then let's label a few more things, starting with the point where the two axes cross. That point is ordered pair 0, 0, and it's called the origin. As you look at your coordinate graph, you can tell that the two axes divided into 4 parts. These are called quadrants. So let's label them. They do go in a certain order. First we have quadrant 1 right here. And to get into quadrant 1, you have to go right, which is positive, and up, which is positive. So all of the ordered pairs that land in this quadrant, quadrant 1, is going to be positive x and a positive y. Our next quadrant is here. And I'm going to just abbreviate on this one. Quadrant 2. Now to land in quadrant 2, you start at the origin always. And to get into quadrant 2, you have to go left, which is a negative number. That tells you that our x is going to always be negative if we land in quadrant 2. You also have to go up to land in quadrant 2, which tells us our y is going to be positive. So any ordered pair that lands in quadrant 2 will be negative x, but then we'll have a positive y. Okay, our next one is here. This is quadrant 3. And let's see what our ordered pair would look like if it landed in quadrant 3. We would start at the origin. We would have to go to the left, which means our x would be a negative number. And we would have to go down, which means our y would also be a negative number. So our ordered pair would be a negative x and a negative y. And last we have quadrant 4. We start at the origin to see what our ordered pair would look like. We would have to go to the right, which means the x is always going to be positive. And we would have to go down, which means our y is going to have to be negative. So our ordered pair in quadrant 4 will always look like a positive x and a negative y. You might take a minute to finish copying before you move on. One common mistake that students make is when they're thinking of naming the quadrants, they automatically think of a clock. So they want to go around like this and say 1, 2, 3, 4. But when you name your quadrants, you need to remember that you actually go counterclockwise. So we start at the right and we go to the left. That's quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4. One way you might remember that, and I wouldn't draw this on my picture, but just remember it in your head, is to think of a coordinate plane. It starts with C. So if I drew a big C, I would start in quadrant 1 when I drew it, right here. I would circle around to quadrant 2, quadrant 3, quadrant 4. Just that visual might help you remember that you go counterclockwise when you label your quadrants. Okay, now let's do a little practice finding the location of points on a quadrant or on a coordinate graph. Let's start with A. If I wanted to label the location of A, remember that I need to start at the origin, which is right here where my axes cross. And to get to A, I'm going to have to go to the left. So I would go backwards, right there, and on my number line, that's the location -7. So that tells me that my x would be -7. Okay, so we've moved across to the -7 on the x-axis. Now we need to go up to get to A. So when I move up, That takes me to right here. And then when I look over at the y-axis, that's up 6. Up is a positive, so my y would be 6. The ordered pair for the location of A is -7, 6. Okay, let's try B. Again, remember we always start at the origin. Now on the origin, we are not moving either direction. Point B is straight down. So that means that I don't move anywhere on the x-axis, which means it's a 0. Okay, then I need to move on the y-axis, and in this case I need to move down. So I move down to right there between the -6 and the -8, and that tells me that my point lies at -7. So my y coordinate would be -7. B lies at 0, -7. Okay, try C and D now. Pause the video, give yourself time to find their locations, and then start the video back up and see if you got them right. Okay, did you get them right? C was backwards 3, or to the left 3, and down 3, so that's a negative and a negative. D, when you start at the origin, was to the right 3 and up 2, so that's a positive, positive. If you got these wrong, I would go back and watch how we did A and B together again before you move on. Okay, what if you already have the ordered pair and you just want to be able to place it in the correct location on the coordinate graph? Let's practice that for a second. Starting with A. If you look at A, it says my point is 3, -2. So I would need to start at the origin. I would go to the right since 3 is positive, so it lands between 2 and 4. And notice I'm not putting anything there, I'm just tracing it with my finger. And then y is -2, which tells me that I would either go up or down. Negative means go down to the -2, which ends up right there where those two lines cross. Okay, let me put that in. Right there. Make sure that your point is where the two lines cross. If you're dealing with integers, that's always going to happen. And I would label that as A. The point is where the location is. The A could be to the right or to the left. It doesn't matter. But the point location is what matters. Okay, let's move on to B. The location of B is -4, 0. So I'm going to start here at the origin. -4 tells me I go to the left to -4. And then the 0 tells me that I do not move up or down the y-axis. So my point goes right there where the -4 is. I'm going to label that point B. Okay, before I move on, with your finger, pause your video, and then with your finger, see if you can find the location of -6, -6, and the location of D, which is 0, 3. Okay, if you got C and D correct, then I would go ahead and move on. If you missed the location of C and D, I would rewind just a little bit and go back to where we placed A on the coordinate graph and watch carefully again.